So today we are going to be looking at a couple of different verses. We're going to start 1 Corinthians 13:4. Don't worry about turning there right now. It's very short. Love is patient and kind. Now don't get your hopes up. I know that I usually read about 16 verses starting out. All of those verses are near the end, so you're not missing out. Are you a patient or a kind person? I think all of us can say that we may struggle in one of those areas. You see, this sermon is a continuation of our sermon series out of 1 Corinthians chapter 13. The sermon series is titled Love Is. This is what love is. And so last week, we read those first three verses, and what did it say? Even if I have all spiritual gifts and I have not love, it counts as nothing. And if I have all talent and I don't love, it doesn't count as anything. And then if I sacrifice everything and I give away everything and I sacrifice my own body and I don't love and I don't do it out of the spirit of love, it means nothing. You see, 1 Corinthians, as a little bit of a recap, even though 1 Corinthians 13 is one of the most beautiful verses in Scripture, it also is not meant necessarily as encouragement. You see, Paul was writing this letter to a group of people, a group of Christians that were missing the mark. They weren't meeting the expectations that they had as followers of Christ. So even though this verse in this scripture sounds flowery and it sounds poetic, the Apostle Paul is using this as a rebuke to the church in Corinth, telling them that they are not being loving. And so what Paul was saying to this church, and we went over this last week, was that all this stuff that you're doing doesn't matter because you're not loving people. That you're not doing it out of a compassionate spirit, out of a spirit of love. And so we get the first thing today when we learned that without love, all of this stuff is useless. Now we learn what is love. Love is patient and kind. Have you heard it said before that you shouldn't ask God for patience because He's going to send something in your life that's going to cause you to need it? We've all heard it. As I've been preparing this sermon, that has been the one thing that everybody has told me. And whenever I said that I was preaching on patience, they said, tell them not to pray for patience because God is going to wreck them. Do you know anybody that claims to know Christ that has a tendency to fly off the hook or to treat people harshly? We all know those people. We often are those people. You see, do you have anything that causes you to lash out? And before you say no, I'm just going to give you a couple of reminders. Bad drivers, traffic, the other political party, people treating other people badly. We have those moments where we're ready to lash out. How about, do you have a threshold for how long you are willing to wait? This is an area where I struggle in. And that could also be with traffic. Waiting on family members to get ready. Brushing past slow people to get a job done. I'm going to say something as a disclaimer on this sermon. I was excited to preach because I would think of myself as a fairly kind person. But as I was studying this, what I realized about myself is that I am a very impatient person. Sometimes you will see 2 Ford Escapes in the parking lot, and that is not by accident. That is because I cannot wait on my wife and son to get ready to come to church. I will be a nervous wreck, and she will tell you when I am waiting, I am mean. I am not necessarily the most kind and loving person. I may not yell or scream, but man, I can say passive-aggressive things in the house. I can tell her that, man, I think I just celebrated a birthday. It's taking you so long to get ready. You see, we all struggle with these things. Have you ever been frustrated by someone saying, I will get to it later, or they got what they deserve? You see, it happens in every area of life. And this is the question we need to answer today. One question that we are going to answer today, and that is, can you live the Christian life without patience and kindness? The answer is no. Because as Christians, we are called to love Christ and to love like Christ. And this is the very definition of what love is. So what did Christ say? We talked about last week. What did Christ say to the Pharisees and the scribes. They said, what is the greatest commandment? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And the second is like unto it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And upon these two things hang the whole law and prophets. What Jesus was saying there was, we are to love God and we are to love other people, and that's it. Because everything will fall into place if we love God and we love others. How do we know that? If we love God, we are not going to make idols. Correct? If we truly love God, then we're not going to use the Sunday school room back there to make a golden calf. We're not going to, because we love God. If we love people, we're not going to murder them. Correct? We're not going to lash out and kill them. Why? Because we love them. We're not going to treat them badly. You see, all of those other commandments fall underneath loving others and loving God. So, if, as Christians, we say that we don't need to be patient to be right with God, or we don't need to be kind to be right with God, even though God used the Apostle Paul to say this is what love is. So, if you are not striving towards being patient and kind, I'm going to tell you something. I'm not trying to be judgmental. You are not in right standing with the Lord. You are not lockstep with what God is calling you to be. So what does it mean to be patient and kind? First of all, we have to know the definition. What is patience? Patience is the capacity to accept or tolerate delay, trouble, or suffering without getting angry or upset. This is our ability to wait and tolerate without losing our minds. Kindness is the quality of being friendly, generous, and considerate. This isn't just for those that deserve it, but, listen to me, for those who can't repay it. So that means that we are to be generous, loving, and kind to people and expect nothing in return. Now, it's easy to be kind with people if we expect for them to be kind back, correct? Because that's just investing in life being easier down the road. But we should be loving and kind without any thought of it coming back to us in a positive way. It gets a little bit difficult. You see, the big question is, can you be a mature or a maturing Christian and not be known to be a patient or a kind person? That is where we have to really draw distinction. We are going to fail sometimes. But we as Christians are called to every day be more and more like Christ. And so every day we are moving forward in this direction of being a kind and patient person. We're not going to get it all right all the time, but we should be making progress. This doesn't mean that you don't react to things. Reacting is human. I'm not telling you that you're not supposed to react to stuff. React in healthy ways. If somebody is yelling at you and screaming at you, if somebody is doing that and you are laughing, then people aren't going to think that you're a patient or kind person. They're going to think you might be crazy. I remember one time when, this is probably a bad example, one time when I had gotten pulled over. I am one of those people, and I'm going to let you guys know, I don't cry. I'm not a crier. I cry very little. I do laugh at terribly inappropriate times. And so I got pulled over one time, and I was a nervous wreck. This was when I got pulled over like a week after I got my license, and I was laughing the entire time that the cop was writing the ticket. That didn't get me out of the ticket. That probably got me in more trouble because I wasn't reacting in a right way. So what I'm saying is if somebody treats you badly, or if somebody hurts you, or somebody does something, I'm not telling you not to react, but reacting badly is a natural response to the brokenness of the world that we live in. Reacting harshly or being impatient, that is a natural response to the brokenness of the world. But we as Christians are called to be different. We as believers in Christ, we as followers of Christ are supposed to be different than the natural world. So that means that we are supposed to strive to be better, that we are to strive to be both patient and kind. You see, the problem is not the occasional slip-up, but the expected response. I want to say that again. The problem here, the sin here, is not the occasional slip-up, but it's if that's our expected response. A good example is, do you know anybody that is a ticking time bomb today? They may be happy, they may be calm right now, but you know what their trigger is. And you know that if you say one thing, that it's going to set them off, that they are going to explode. Well, you see, that isn't about an occasional slip, but that person would have what we would call an expected response to something, correct? Like, do you have a family member that if a conversation starts about politics, that all kindness and civility go out the window, they're going to kill each other? It doesn't matter if they're brother and sister. They are going to fight till the cows come home if somebody brings up politics. What does that say, though? That says that when a topic is brought up, there is an expected response that people will not treat people with love and kindness, correct? We all struggle with it. If you don't believe it exists, get on Facebook for like 30 minutes today. You're going to see about 5 fights that have already broken out this morning. You see, James 5, 7 through 8 says, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how a farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand." You see, James, we went over this in the last sermon series. James is calling us to be ready to wait. Let's mark that down. Let's memorize that. James is calling us in that verse to be ready to wait. Just like a farmer, the farmer expects delay. The farmer compensates for good and bad weather, correct? They are expecting for every day not to be perfect. They are preparing to wait. Imagine that you are flying out of a busy airport. If you've ever flown out of like Atlanta or something like that, a busy airport. When you go to the airport, how do you prepare for your trip at the airport? Well, before you leave, you make sure that you have your passport, or you make sure you have your identification ready. You check to make sure you have the right amount of forms of identification, correct? You make sure that your ticket is printed out and ready to go. You don't get to the airport and buy your ticket. You try to buy it beforehand to make sure there's room. You make sure that every suitcase doesn't have what it's not supposed to have. And then what also do you do? If you have kids, you charge every device in the house. If it is wireless, it is going in a suitcase. It's there to distract. You have snacks stuck in probably the pockets of the suitcase and probably the pockets of your children to make sure that you are managing what is going to be a stressful situation. What do you do when you fly out of the airport? You are not only preparing to get on the plane as quickly as you can, but you also are preparing for delay. You are trying to get everything ready so when you sit down in that seat that you're not dealing with a meltdown, correct? When you get to the airport, if you have a rental car, do you show up when it's time to get the rental car? No. You find out where the rental car is supposed to be dropped off beforehand. You prepare for difficulty. You prepare for waiting. You see, the Christian life should compensate for expected delay, frustration, and to react with kindness in the midst of frustrating circumstances. This is what I want us to try to strive for today. If we are prepared for life to be difficult, if when we wake up in the morning, we know that something is going to happen today that's going to try to knock us off our game. We know that something is going to happen today that's going to try to throw us off what God wants us to do. If we are prepared for that, if we get in Scripture in the morning because we need a word from the Lord to prepare us for that difficulty, if we are on our face before the Lord saying, God, you take control of this day and you make me into who you want me to be, what are we doing there? We're preparing for difficulty. So when that difficulty comes, we already know how to react to it. When this bad thing happens, we know that the Lord is going to get us through it. I would say, if you know that traffic is going to be bad, do you complain about traffic? Probably a little bit. But if you don't expect traffic to be bad and you're stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic on Market Street, you're going to be mad because you're not ready for it. You haven't prepared. But ultimately, this is not just something that we are to strive to do. This is the example that Christ set for us. This is not just something that we are to hunker down, put on our work boots, and we are going to try to do and get right, because if Christ isn't doing the work within us, then it's not going to work. But what did Christ do? We see that Christ both was patient and kind. And who was he patient and kind with? The very writer of 1 Corinthians, and that was the Apostle Paul. I'm going to go ahead and read a few verses. Chapter 8 of Acts, verses 1 through 3, and 9, 1 through 16. And Saul approved of his execution, talking about Stephen. And there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the region of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church and entering in house after house. And he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. Chapter 9, verse 1 through 16. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, this is serious, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way or to Christians, men or women, that he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. Falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus who you are persecuting. But rise and enter into the city, and you will be told what you are to do. And the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. And Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. And there was a disciple of Damascus named Ananias. And the Lord said to him in a vision, Ananias. And he said, here am I, Lord. And he said, rise up and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas, and look for a man of Tarshish named Saul. For behold, he is praying, and he has seen a vision of a man named Ananias come and lay hands on him, that he might regain his sight. But Ananias answered and said, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem. And here he has the authority from the high chief priest to bind all who are in your name. But the Lord said to him, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and the kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. Why does this show the patience and the kindness of God? Paul, as the church was growing, Paul decided to actively persecute Christians. And not just that he was talking badly about Christians, he was imprisoning and honestly involved in whether or not he was actually killing the Christians, but he was getting on stage and breathing threats of murder against Christians everywhere. To the point where not only did he hate Christians, but he was going as far as to get letters from the priest so that he could imprison Christians and drag them out of their houses. This was not a good guy. No one would look at Paul today at this state in his life and think, oh, we just need to give him a chance. Right? Like, yeah, he doesn't like us, but what can you do about it? He was actively trying to kill Christians. He was a bad guy. But if Christ was not patient, what if Christ had judged Paul when he was doing the prisoning, the killing, the watching, the planning, and the destroying of the church? Instead of immediate justice, would have been fair, though. Let's all agree. The first time when Paul was standing there holding those garments, when Saul was standing there holding those garments and they were stoning Stephen, he deserved punishment from God at that moment. God would have been completely within his glory and his grace and his sovereignty to kill Paul at that moment, because Paul was doing damage to his church, whom he loves. It would have been fair, but God played the long game. Even Ananias reminded the Lord of who Saul was, that this man did not deserve healing, even he deserved judgment. But Ananias didn't see what would happen. You see, Paul would go on to be the greatest missionary of all time. Paul would go on to rock Asia Minor and Macedonia and Jerusalem and Rome for the gospel. Paul was a force to be reckoned with. Ananias didn't see what God was going to use Paul for. All Ananias saw was a criminal. What God saw was that no matter what Saul was doing against the church, that he was going to do so much bigger things when God got his attention. And that was much later. That was well into his persecution. If we are to be like Christ, then we are called to love like Christ. We are called to be patient through suffering and difficulty, and kind to the people that cause that suffering and that difficulty. Why is that? It's just hard for us to realize sometimes. And I want to say this with as much love and grace as I can. You, before coming into a relationship with Christ, were an enemy of God. You, before you gave up running from God, which that is our salvation, correct? Our salvation wasn't that I was a first-round draft pick and God in heaven said, man, Jamie is killing it right now. I'm going to upgrade him to, my team. That wasn't what my salvation was. God saw me in my brokenness. God saw me in my helplessness. And what did he say? Jamie is a messed up person, and I am going to do something through him. Jamie does not deserve my grace, and I'm going to give it to him because I want to have a relationship with Jamie, even though Jamie doesn't deserve that relationship. So then what happens if God, in his grace towards me, saved me, even though I was broken, even though I didn't deserve his grace, and then I go and I don't give that same grace to somebody else? That was one of the parables, saying about that person that owed the master money. And what did that person say? That person said, forgive me my debt. And the master said, you're forgiven all your debt. And then he went out and found someone that owed him money and threw him in prison because he wasn't paying him. Why? The master gave grace, and then that wicked servant turned around after he had received grace and dealt harshly with somebody else that could have used that grace to begin with. We, as believers, are called to give grace and love and patience and kindness because we have a God that gave us grace and love and patience and kindness. It's not something that we should think is hard for us to do. It is basic Christian life. We treat everybody we come in contact with love, and that is that we are patient with them and that we are kind towards them. That's all we're called to do as Christians, and yet we miss it so often. There is no excuse for the Christian to be unkind and impatient. But also, we are not dealing in a fantasy world here. This isn't all rainbows and sunshine when you leave here. You're not going to see a unicorn running down the road when you walk out to your car. The world is rough. This is a tough and frustrating place that we live in because we live in a broken world that is separated from the God who we serve and love. But we are to act and react to real life situations with patience and kindness. So I'm not telling you today that if you're patient and kind with people that they are going to treat you well. They won't. I am not telling you today that you are to forgive that person that has wronged you in hopes that they are never going to wrong you again. They will probably wrong you again. They are going to frustrate you again. They are going to let you down again. They are going to cause you to be uncomfortable and wait. But you are not loving that person because of that person. You are loving that person because God has called us to. So my encouragement today is this. Are you a patient and kind person? If you're not, there is time and there is grace available to you. But you have to make that decision.